A new life is born with the reincarnation of a young girl named Cheryl Mason, the adopted daughter of Harry Mason. In a previous life, Cheryl Mason was the spiritual half of her other soul, Alessa Gillespie, split into two halves after the failure of a ritual from a mother who wanted to subject her daughter into a ritual to serve as the host mother for conceiving the cult's god. As a last-ditch attempt to exact control and change this fate with what little power she had, Alessa split her consciousness into the byproduct of another version of herself, meant to live the happy, innocent life she never had. This wouldn't last, however, as Cheryl and Alessa would eventually be rekindled and become whole again, orchestrating the ritual from its dormant state and seeing the completion of a false god called the Incubus, appearing as a demonic-like entity that appeared as a demon but had the powers of a deity. However, Harry Mason would prove this was nothing more than a lesser god, with sheer perseverance slaying the Incubus, ending this ritual, and finding the rebirth of his daughter, Cheryl Mason. Taken aback and hesitant about the rebirth of his daughter, whom he had taken care of for 7 years prior, Harry was understandably hesitant and worried about what this would bring into his life, with the knowledge of his daughter being connected to the cults. Yet, he saw the good in this evil with the love and humanity invested in him. Harry Mason took in this reincarnated Cheryl Mason and started a new life with his daughter. As years went by, Harry took care of Cheryl with love and affection in hopes of providing her with the natural and caring life she deserved. The family would move to Portland, presumably Portland, Maine. In these 5 years of peace and solitude, Harry would raise Cheryl without any issues. However, the trauma would linger, following him closely behind, slowly revealing his scars and wounds. Harry internally suffered with a guilty conscience with thoughts of seeing Cheryl as a replacement for her past self, and even battled with his intrusive thoughts of strangling her to death. Due to his worries about her connection to the Order, more specifically, Alessa Gillespie. With this internal conflict derived from his subconscious, Harry acknowledged that those events are from the past, and what's important in this moment is what he shares with Cheryl in hopes of giving her a better future. With these fears and worries discarded, Harry would continue raising Cheryl for many years to follow. However, these peaceful years wouldn't last forever, as fate would eventually catch up to the family. Because of Harry's actions in stopping the ritual, this did not sit well with the cults, resulting in the Order seeking revenge. These consequences would lead the cult to hunt down the pair endlessly, with the intentions of kidnapping Cheryl and killing Harry. One day, Harry and Cheryl are abruptly attacked by one of the cult members, leaving Harry with no choice but to use his handgun in self-defense, killing one of the cultists. Startled and phased, Harry decided to relocate with Cheryl once again, farther away from Portland to an undisclosed location. The residency would be in an apartment building called Daisy Villa Apartments. Harry ultimately decided to change Cheryl's identity to Heather Mason and dye her hair blonde. On one of her birthdays, Harry would give Cheryl a beautiful pendant. Harry told Cheryl to promise him that she would protect this pendant with her life, using it only when absolutely necessary. Unbeknownst to Heather, this pendant would hold the red liquid known as a glutton, an ancient herb grown in the Arabian deserts. According to the Kabbalah, a Jewish text that translates mysticism or occult folklore, the glutton acts as a herb that, when taken, dispels evil spirits or forces from corruption or possession. Honoring her father's wishes, Heather would wear this pendant as a necklace, ensuring it was with her at all times. For the years to come, Heather and Harry would live relatively peaceful lives, seeing them unscathed for the most part. However, nothing lasts forever. Awakening in this amusement park that should be filled with laughter amongst the crowd, or screams from those riding in a fast, thrill-seeking rush of a roller coaster. Expectations of what should be seen as normalcy are anything but that. In this dark, ominous atmosphere, there's an industrial-like setting with monsters roaming freely, mascots lying unconscious, presumably dead, or the lack of noise, filled with an eerie silence that doesn't feel right, as if there should be a hint of life that was once here. On one fateful evening, Heather Mason, who is now 17 years old, is introduced to this haunting atmosphere of nightmares. Unbeknownst to her, she finds herself wandering in these abandoned theme park grounds called Lakeside Amusement Park, a local attraction widely known as one of the popular tourist spots in Silent Hill. As Heather enters and views the surrounding area, she finds herself questioning where she is, becoming haunted by the knife she suddenly wields in her hand as a form of protection, Close by in the entrance is a mascot representing Lakeside Amusement Park named Robbie the Rabbit. Seen as the main mascot, he is also accompanied by 3 others: Kathy the Kitty, Huey the Horse, and Don the Duck. In universe, Robbie the Rabbit is merely a mascot meant to be a prominent figure, advertising Lakeside Amusement Park as its poster boy, marketed as a product in the form of merchandise. Heather's comment alludes to the possibility that the mascot is presumably dead, as there are implications that someone is inside the mascot's suit. However, this is speculation on her part, and it's never confirmed otherwise. Rather, it's meant to give the ambiguity to the nature of how the other world projects these nightmarish delusions into reality. Leaving the entrance, Heather has to navigate the otherworld Lakeside Amusement Park, either fighting or evading monsters that serve as an obstacle in her path. Eventually, she finds herself atop the mountain coaster, seeing herself having to walk cautiously along the roller coaster tracks. After navigating the rickety roller coaster tracks, Heather suddenly hears a roller coaster car activate. Stuck with nowhere else to go, Heather is forced to watch in horror as a roller coaster car makes contact with her at an alarming speed, killing her instantly as she screams violently. Awakening from this nightmare, Heather wakes up in a fast food restaurant named Happy Burger. In this moment of tranquility, she becomes lost in thought and ponders as she stares at the window, peering into the outside. With the time to recollect and take a moment to breathe, Heather stores her pendant away inside her white jacket and heads off into Central Square Shopping Center. Heather walks to a nearby telephone to call her dad Harry, happily telling him it's her and apologizing that she didn't call sooner as she missed his previous call. She apologizes and tells him that she didn't get the thing he asked for, but Harry forgives her. Ending the call, Harry tells Heather that he loves her and tells her goodbye, which he also says goodbye and she loves him too. As she hangs up the telephone, she is abruptly disturbed by an old man named Douglas Cartland, a freelance detective who was hired to find Heather, asking her that he only needs 30 minutes of her time for important business matters that pertain to her birth. An old man in his 50s who has worked on missing persons and personal conduct cases as a former police detective, now retired from the police force 10 years ago, spending his days working as a freelance private investigator. In his early years, Douglas was initially a police detective for an undisclosed police department. However, it's known that at some point, he was tasked to go to Silent Hill for a missing persons case, but unfortunately, left the case open and never resolved it. In his character biography in the official novel, Lost Memories: Silent Hill Chronicle, Douglas is mentioned as a widower, referring to his deceased ex-wife who passed away before he retired 10 years ago from the police force. At some point during his relationship with his wife before they divorced, they had a son. However, due to financial debt and issues, Douglas's son attempted to rob a bank, which resulted in his son being killed by gunfire. Douglas refers to his son as a penniless good-for-nothing, yet feels like his son's death was his fault. Before meeting Heather, Douglas was hired by Claudia Wolf, a high priestess of the order, hiring him to seek out Heather, luring her into meeting Claudia. However, unbeknownst to Douglas, Claudia coerces him into bringing Heather to her without context for her true intentions. As Heather and Douglas meet, Heather is immediately apprehensive and cold towards Douglas, as it implies she may have a fear of stalkers, encompassing a cold and harsh exterior to those who may come off as predatory or creepy with ulterior motives. Heather's suspicions are proven true as Douglas unintentionally comes off as forward and creepy as he wants to be alone with Heather for 30 minutes discussing her birth. Although Douglas reaffirms her concerns by clarifying that he's a detective, she sarcastically replies as if she's amused and comments that her dad told her to never talk to strangers. As Heather walks away, Douglas follows closely behind. Irritated and rightfully frustrated, Heather shouts at him if he's still following her and if she has to scream to get her point across. Douglas apologizes and states he'll wait outside the women's bathroom, where Heather retreats to. Inside the women's bathroom sits a mirror with a red symbol marked in blood. The halo of the sun symbolizes the order's virtues and ideologies when it comes to their scriptures and teachings about their god. According to a memo titled About the Cult Symbol, states that the symbol represents a religious group, the order, with 2 outer circles representing charity and resurrection. The 3 inner circles represent present, past, and future. Interestingly, if the symbol were to be reversed in the color blue, this reverses the meaning into implanting a curse upon God. The charity refers to the Christian virtue in Christian theology, more specifically, the virtue of love. According to Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar and priest who practiced philosophy and theology, believed that of the 7 Christian virtues, charity represented the friendship of man for God, which unites us with God. Furthering his belief, he states that charity not only extends to the love of God, but also to the love of our neighbor. Resurrection refers to the belief that Jesus Christ, after being crucified on the cross, and his sacrifice to promise humankind in his death that sin would be cleansed and that they are forgiven, as he rose on the 3rd day, called Judgment Day or the Second Coming of Christ. Before Claudia Wolf, Dahlia Gillespie, former high priestess of the order, had a heavily devoted belief in the occult practices that saw her use a means to exploit and corrupt an item, in this context, Alessa Gillespie, subjecting her own daughter to supernaturally impregnate a living embryo of God through this pain and suffering. By harvesting this pain and suffering, it allows her to manipulate and corrupt this form of quote-unquote love to her daughter by endorsing this higher power for herself through this cleansing of the earth with one's sacrifice, referring to the immorality and sin that plague the earth with death, war, crimes, or disease, warrants this rebirth of a perfect world, although in her image. Claudia Wolf would follow these ideologies adopted from Dahlia Gillespie. However, she would adopt her own interpretation of her belief in the birth of God and resurrection of a new paradise. Past, present, and future serve as a symbolic representation of Heather Mason. On subsequent occasions, Heather comments as she interacts with the halo of the sun. She comments on how each time she looks at the symbol, her head hurts violently, but also feels like she's desperately trying to uncover and remember long-lost distant memories. The past refers to her previous lives, Alessa and Cheryl. The present to her current self, Heather Mason, and finally, the future, the reincarnation of God, birthing a new paradise from humankind. The halo of the sun functions as an allegory, serving as a lens for the player to look into, metaphorically speaking, Heather's journey throughout the progression of her story, seeing Heather uncover her lost memories from her past lives to realize the pain, suffering, and trauma they had to embrace and go through. In this understanding, it allows her to acknowledge this pain, but also learn to accept what has happened to her, to learn to let go and move on. As Heather waits in the bathroom for Douglas to leave, she gets impatient and instead finds the window open, seeing it as a means of escaping. Heather finds herself in an alleyway outside the mall, needing to re-enter. Upon doing so, Heather finds the mall empty, although finds one mall store open called Boutique Marquette. Once entering, much to her surprise, she finds a handgun lying on the ground. Curious, Heather picks up the weapon and hears an odd sound in the corner of the room. She sees a disturbing scene of an otherworldly monster feasting on the corpse of a young brunette woman. Shocked, Heather steps back away slowly, utterly terrified, as the monster slowly walks to her. Heather, commanding the monster to stay back and refusing to comply, forces her to use the handgun and proceed to fire bullets at the monster, killing it as it falls to the ground. A tall, looming, and menacing creature that stands confident in its size. The monster called the Closer encompasses a tall stature, with its head embodying a mouth, as well as the creature's arms. When attacking, they throw out their arms rather sluggishly, with a sharp, tendril-like blade protruding out as it omits this action. Upon first glance, the Closer looks reminiscent of the Mandarin, a previous monster that appeared in Silent Hill 2. Both monsters share a similar appearance in their size, body, and arm structure. This is no coincidence, as series monster designer Masahiro Ito comments that the appearance being similar to that of the Mandarin when compared to the Closer is meant to serve a connection between Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3. Masahiro Ito expresses the lack of representation of the Closer in the original Silent Hill 2, as it was mostly vague and infrequent in its appearance, deemed as ignored. With this fondness he has for the monster, he addresses the Closer and Mandarin are not necessarily the same monster for James or Heather respectively, rather, not dependent on the person, but the manifestation of the town's power that arises from the collective thought of those who previously were sent to Silent Hill. Rather, not dependent on the person solely, but the manifestation of the town's power that arises from the collective thought of those who were sent to Silent Hill previously, which has an influence on the monster's design. The name, Closer, comes from the ability to obstruct a path with its massive proportions of arms. With the monster dead and a new weapon in hand, Heather gains the courage to continue navigating the mall in hopes of escaping. Heather eventually finds a store called Helen's Bakery, where she finds a bunch of bread, noting that it's bread, and she isn't feeling hungry at this moment. Close by sits a pair of tongs, which she needs to grab an item. In the storeroom, Heather uses the tongs to grab the My Bestsellers bookstore key. On the second floor, Heather uses the key to enter My Bestsellers bookstore. Inside the store is a puzzle that she needs to solve by reorganizing Shakespeare anthology books. For the keypad on the door in the back of the store to exit. Exiting the store, Heather is suddenly met with a mysterious, ominous woman with a black dress and long blonde hair who is barefoot and has missing eyebrows, standing at the end of the hallway, menacingly, as if she were expecting Heather. This woman is named Claudia Wolf, the high priestess of the cults, the Order. Upon meeting Heather, at first glance, she is initially pleased to find another human alive, as much of the mall is missing people and left with monsters roaming around. In hopes of finding answers, Heather asks Claudia where everybody is and what's going on. Claudia responds with a very cryptic and vague description that mentions the rebirth of paradise, and that Heather will need to remember her true self and what she must become, the woman who will lead her followers to paradise, referring to Heather as the Holy Mother of God. Heather, still not comprehending Claudia's vague nature, doesn't care or seems to be interested in what she's talking about, only questioning her if she did all this. She responds that this was an act of God. Heather then suddenly has violent headaches and cramps as she moans in pain. This alludes to Heather in a supernatural context who gets forcibly impregnated with the embryo of God as she would be deemed as a surrogate mother to give birth to this god. This is possible with Heather's connection to her previous life, Alessa Gillespie. Claudia was raised in Silent Hill as a devout follower of the cults, residing in the chapel where the Order practiced and taught their virtues and beliefs to their followers. Claudia had a very similar upbringing to Alessa. Much of Claudia's childhood saw her as a victim of abuse, as her father, Leonard Wolf, would forcefully beat her through physical punishment if she ever was caught acting in a religious behavior. This physical abuse was followed by methods such as screaming, hitting, beating, or kicking her until she stopped crying and accepted this religious doctrine and God as the one true faith to follow and practice. Because of this emotional and physical trauma, Claudia would be brainwashed into believing the Order's rhetoric and practicing their teachings, much like her best friend, Alessa Gillespie, who was also a victim of emotional and physical abuse from her mother to forcibly practice and accept the religion and faith. When they were kids, Alessa, who was a couple of years older than Claudia, would meet with her at church to pray to their God. With this warmth and loving friendship they both had, in some tragic but melancholy way, confided in each other. With this blossoming friendship, Claudia viewed Alessa as her sister, spending almost all the time they had together playing with cards or drawing pictures. On Claudia's 6th birthday, Alessa gave her a birthday card which read, "To little Claudia, happy 6th birthday. I love you as if you were my real sister. Here's to you." Even into adulthood, Claudia would treasure these mementos and memories of the time she had as a child of Alessa, and she deeply valued and respected their friendship. However, this friendship wouldn't last forever. Alessa, when she was 7 years old, would one day be subjected to a forced ritual performed by her mother, Dahlia, to forcefully impregnate her daughter through a ritual involving the halo of the sun, with candles lit around its circumference, and using spiritualistic performances through occult magic to commence this ceremony. This ritual would see Alessa brutally burned due to the ritual going wrong, where she would catch on fire, leading to the surrounding interior of the Gillespie household burning in flames. To the eyes of the public, Alessa was pronounced as dead, when in actuality, Alessa would be hidden in Alchemist Hospital's basement, suffering for 7 long years. It's unknown if Claudia knew about Alessa being kept hidden and left alive, but what is known is that she would be well aware of Harry Mason stopping the ritual, then if she saw Alessa, called the Incubator, give birth to the Incubus, the manifestation of the cult's collective subconscious thoughts and idealization of envisioning their idea of God. Harry would successfully kill this false god, which saw the collapse of the ritual, and Alessa's death as she would sacrifice her life to reincarnate Cheryl Mason. Heather, as a thank you to Harry, and to make amends for her pain and suffering as a bittersweet sentiment. Because of Harry's actions in taking in the reincarnation of Cheryl as his adopted daughter, Claudia saw this with a hateful and corrupted lens, as to her, this was Harry kidnapping and brainwashing her childhood best friend. In the 17 years to follow, Claudia would rise to the ranks of the cults, becoming the high priestess of the Order, and exacted revenge by orchestrating a plan to kill Harry Mason, as a means to manipulate Heather into emotionally expressing hatred and revenge to expedite the birth of God. After this exchange of Claudia, Heather makes her way to an elevator. Inside, she sees a radio drop in front of her, which is designed to emit radio frequencies to alert Heather of monsters nearby. Upon stepping into the elevator, Heather then sees the transition to the Otherworld Central Square shopping center, finding the once lively and robust atmosphere of the mall in this now rusted and industrial-like quality. Upon leaving the elevator, Heather is met with a monster called the Double Head. These canine-like monsters usually appear in groups of 2 or 4, searching the area to attack their prey. They possess a notable feature that sees a vertical split with their jawline where their tongues hang lazily, and the inside of the head shows flesh. Bandages cover the body of the dog, as it's meant to have 2 separate dogs conjoined together, serving as visual imagery of the bandages that Alessa Gillespie had to wear from her severe burns and scars from being burned alive. The idea of 2 dogs splitting into 2 and having each respective body conjoined together could be a metaphor for Alessa and Cheryl Mason's soul split in half and later rejoined as one. Masahiro Ito claims that the purpose of putting the double head at the beginning of the story, specifically Central Square Shopping Center, was to convey the hopelessness and vulnerability of Heather entering a hellish world. Much of the inspiration for the double head's design was based on the Greek mythology creature named Cerberus, a monstrous, multi-headed dog that is appointed as the watchdog at the entrance of the underworld. The connection between Silent Hill and Hell, while not meant to be taken literally, is rather a metaphor and allusion to the idea of Silent Hill, figuratively speaking, manifesting our fears, traumas, and internal thoughts into physical form, which is derived from the other world to project these nightmarish delusions into reality. The double head can serve as an allusion to Cerberus as it guards the other world, which, given the interpretation, can be seen as a form of hell. In the Otherworld Central Square Shopping Center, after killing or evading doubleheads and closers, Heather eventually finds a flashlight to illuminate the darkness throughout the liminal hallways of the mall. Close by, Heather finds a women's bathroom which holds a bottle of bleach. Further down the hall, Heather re-enters a now industrial decayed version of Boutique Marquette's. Inside, she finds a hanger. Later on, Heather finds Happy Burger with a ladder that hangs from the ceiling. With a hanger, Heather pulls down the ladder and proceeds to climb up to the 2nd floor. On the 2nd floor, Heather finds hospital gurneys of deceased bodies, representing Alessa. Elsewhere, Heather finds a CRT TV that emits loud static and white noise. Curious, she watches the TV to see the image shift to a vague and quick frame of a little girl screaming out to someone, which is Cheryl Mason. In a jewelry store, Heather finds a walnut inside a smashed glass case. With this walnut, Heather then heads up to the escalator to the 3rd floor to a Chinese restaurant. Inside the Chinese restaurant, Heather finds a grotesque and putrid image of a deceased dog with its stomach slit open, pouring out flesh. Inside the flesh holds the cooked key. With the key, Heather backtracks to a hallway to unlock a door to Cafe Paradise Noon. Leaving the store, she finds herself on one of the mall floors, with a grandiose view of the mall. On this floor, she then meets a monster called the Numb Body. A veiny, pale-like monster, the Numb Body features relatively minor details to its design, as its notable quality is the body itself, using its legs for traversal. Much of the Numb Body's attacks are heavily dependent on momentum, such as walking towards or hopping side by side when encountering Heather or evading her attacks. Its only attack is ramming against Heather with its head-like mouth. Usually, Numb Bodies are seen either alone or in large groups with small and large variants. Numb Body is derived from the slow and clumsy-like movements and the pale, veiny-like skin of its body. According to Masahiro Ito, he didn't design the monster of the Numb Body, instead only designed Valtiel, Closer, Nurse, the Slurper, and God. Because of this, some of the monsters in Silent Hill 3 don't have fleshed out symbolism in mind, with no special meaning, and instead, vague and abstract interpretations that are up for speculation as to what they could mean. After this encounter with the Numb Body, Heather finds herself in the kitchen of Hallen's Bakery, collecting a bottle of detergent. Leaving the store, Heather sees a hallway with a fan at the end, currently activated as it spins in a circular motion. After turning off the fan, Heather enters the next room close by, seeing a swarm of moths blocking her path. However, she finds a bucket that sits in the corner of the room. With this bucket, Heather creates an insecticide to kill the moths, mixing both the detergent and bleach to create a powerful chemical to dispose of the moths. With the moths deceased and now her path open, Heather continues and navigates the hallways of the mall. Entering a nearby sports store, Heather finds a device to insert the walnut to crack it open, finding the moonstone. With the obtained moonstone, Heather backtracks to a door with an outline of a large, red crescent moon to insert the moonstone inside. Interestingly, above the moonstone door is the Hail of the Sun symbol, although visually interpreted as blue, reversing this meaning of the Hail of the Sun and instead viewed as a curse and burden. This is likely symbolic of the themes of pregnancy, as the message implies cries of pain are heard, and the final destination has become real, alluding to the moans and cries of a woman in pain while conceiving during childbirth, which serves as an allegory for the birth of a new paradise as the final destination. With the moonstone door unlocked, Heather finds herself atop the 3rd floor of the Otherworld Central Square shopping center. At the edge of a platform is a ladder that ascends further into the deep void of the mall, leaving Heather no other choice but to scale down the ladder. At the bottom, Heather finds a large arena with 6 gaping holes in the wall. Suddenly, Heather finds a monster that protrudes out of the rubble, which is monstrous in size. This monster, known as the split worm, is massive in its worm-like size with a large, lavender-colored outer layer that splits wide open, revealing a head with massive jaws and the resemblance of human-like teeth. The split worm uses its body to contract and move with its momentum, much like a worm, to submerge through holes and appear in others nearby to surprise Heather in catching her off guard. Once revealed, the split worm will open its outer shell-like layer, revealing its mouth to lunge and attack Heather. While not given a concrete description surrounding its meaning, the split head can be interpreted in different ways. Because the split worm is parallel to the split head from Silent Hill 1, it likely depicts that of an insect-like creature, which subconsciously manifests Alessa's disgust and fear of insects. The phallic-like appearance of the split worm can be seen as that of a female ovum, such as an embryonic egg. The physical traits of the split worm itself bear resemblance to those of maternity and a child's emergence from the womb. The protective, lavender-colored layer of the shell can represent the uterus encasing and protecting the fetus, given its distinctive human-like features, such as the white teeth and mouth. Connecting this is the previously seen poem on the moonstone door, referring to the cycle of birth, with allusions to a woman's pregnancy. With the defeat of the split worm, Heather sees the environment transition back to the Central Square shopping center. As she makes her way to the front entrance of the mall, she encounters Douglas once again. Heather lashes out at Douglas, assuming Douglas is working together with Claudia. Douglas defends himself, stating that he has no idea what's happening and he was only hired by Claudia to find Heather. Heather suggests that the events occurring could possibly be related to her, but she isn't entirely certain. As she leaves, Douglas asks where she's going and what he should do, with Heather replying, "Hell if I know," while leaving for the subway station. In Hazel Street subway station, Heather finds a newspaper with a news headline titled, "Fatal Accident at Hazel Street." In this newspaper article, it explains that at 11 p.m. on the 4th, describes a man who was waiting on the subway platform for a subway train to arrive, suddenly fell on the train tracks, and shortly after, got his head decapitated by the oncoming subway train. The victim died immediately upon impact. After finding a nutcracker and inserting this into a bolt to access the gate, Heather heads down the staircase to platform 4. Here, she finds a continuation of the newspaper article about the fatal accident at Hazel Street. In this Occult Magazine article, it depicts a legend of the poor souls that died suddenly by suicide or an accident, not realizing they are dead. These spirits are unaware of their current state, as they have lost their human senses, and are forced to relive the memories of their deaths, replaying them on repeats. Because of this, these spirits resort to humans for salvation, or by possessing them to do acts without their consent, such as committing suicide or participating in a fatal accident that inflicts pain upon themselves. This newspaper article likely serves as not only a cautionary tale, but also as a symbolic representation of the cycle of rebirth, particularly death. Alessa Gillespie participated in a ritualistic suicide after living with 7 years of her excruciating pain from the wounds she was burdened with, seeking death as the only option to end her suffering. Alessa devised the ritual with the seal of Metatron as an act of annihilation upon the town of Silent Hill, more specifically, the Order, but with the intentions of committing suicide to end her pain and suffering, as she couldn't end her life by natural means, as the embryonic god inside of her womb protected the surrogate mother from any sense of harm towards her. Shortly after finding this Occult Magazine, Heather then finds herself at Platform 4, the spot rumored to be haunted, where ghosts lurk for its next victim. As Heather cautiously approaches the edge of the platform, she suddenly gets shoved, falling from the platform and onto the train tracks. Immediately after, Heather hears an oncoming subway train, resulting in her thinking and acting quickly by hopping back onto the platform, avoiding near death. After this harrowing experience, Heather explores more of the subway station to then discover a monster known as the Insane Cancer. Embodying sheer mass in their hulking appearance, the Insane Cancer is reminiscent of that of a cancerous disease. With an appearance that exudes a cancerous-like form, the monster has blob-like and tumor-like flesh that manifests this appearance of a monstrous behemoth. The Insane Cancer, while slow in its movement, will show physical prowess and its strength by attacking Heather with powerful punches, knocking her back. If intimidated, the monster will sprint headfirst into Heather at alarming speeds. The Lost Memories Soundhole Chronicle mentions that the Insane Cancer is represented as a cancer running wild due to the cancer-like appearance it bears. It's possible this theme of cancer can be synonymous with the running themes of disease and death in Silent Hill. In the town's early history, it suffered from an unforeseen plague epidemic that killed off the townspeople. This symbolism is more likely represented through Alessa Gillespie, as she likely saw herself as a literal and figurative disease when it came to her presence around people. In her youth, Alessa was severely bullied through verbal and physical abuse by her classmates, often resulting in her desk having carved scribbles with offensive and hostile words, telling her she's a witch or to go die, treating her as if she was a disease. Alessa's mutilation from the burns she suffered after the ritual performed by her mother saw her with a disturbing appearance, likely perceiving herself as a cancer that refuses to die. After this encounter with the Insane Cancer, Heather finds a nearby subway car with an open gift wrap box containing a shotgun, which she adds to her ever-growing arsenal to combat monsters. Eventually, Heather finds herself on the east side of Platform 3, seeing a bright red light atop a white door. Curious, Heather drops down to interact with the door, only to find the lock is broken. Suddenly, Heather hears the loud sounds of an oncoming subway train. Reacting quickly, she jumps on Platform 3 again, narrowly escaping death. On the same platform, Heather must travel back of the subway train to board and leave the subway station. As she boards, she then needs to fight monsters in connecting, tight, enclosed linear subway cars to navigate to the front of the subway train. Once arriving to her destination, Heather descends into the underpass. As she walks through the ominous, dark hallways, Heather suddenly sees the hallways become soaked and filled with blood, depleting her of her health, becoming susceptible to oncoming attacks by the monsters, given her vulnerable state. Navigating the underpass, Heather finds an empty wine bottle to hold oil, which she'll later need to fuel a generator. With the generator filled with kerosene, Heather descends further into the underpass, making her way through the sewers, eventually stumbling upon a new monster known as the Pendulum, a disturbing, hovering monster with much of its agility being airborne. The Pendulum features two halves of its body stitched by its torsos, with industrial, metal-like blades. The blades are attached to their heads, which they use by gyrating their bodies in a circular, forward motion when engaging with Heather to attack her. While floating, they make a loud, ear-piercing sound that emulates that of a rusty, metal-grinding screeching. In the Lost Memories Soundhole Chronicle, the Pendulum is derived from the creature's method of attack, which is from its circular motion of rotating its body forward. Because the creature wasn't designed by Masahiro Ito, but rather Jun Inoue, he reiterates that not all the monsters have symbolic meaning to them individually. If we were to try to determine an interpretation of the Pendulum, however, it's likely a manifestation of the embryonic god, more specifically, the cauterization of a fetus. This refers to a surgical procedure in the lining of the uterus, often used as the first method for a pregnant woman undergoing a miscarriage or abortion to abort the fetus. This connects to Heather as her soul journey is aborting this unwarranted embryo of the god that grows inside of her, such as the final act in the story where we see her take a Galaphagus which exorcises the demon. In this context, aborting the fetus of God is an attempt to prevent it from manifesting and growing into its mature form. Furthering this navigation of the complex, maze-like labyrinth of the underpass, Heather eventually finds a garbage room to acquire a hairdryer. Eventually, she finds another room that tells a cautionary tale of a sewer monster, killing most of the staff who worked in the sewers once they encountered the monster, seeing their fate sealed as they would get entrapped by its long, tentacle-like arm and be devoured one by one. To pass the bridge safely to the other side without being overwhelmed by the sewer monster, Heather must use the hairdryer and the outlet to then throw it into the waters below to electrify the monster, effectively killing it. While unidentifiable, the sewer monster, given its long, tentacle-like arm, likely parallels the Bloodsucker from Silent Hill 1. Both creatures bear similarities in its appearance and behavior, such as its undesirable lust for blood or to kill and feast on its prey. The monster can also be rooted in Japanese folklore, inspired by the yokai called the Oitikibori, a mysterious apparition that embodies the formation of a human ghost-like entity that approaches a fisherman. As the fisherman sits atop the bridge to catch fish, the Oitikibori reaches out with its long arm to terrorize and disturb the fisherman, attempting to steal and consume his fish. In more disturbing instances, a fisherman can be unlucky, where the Oitikibori will extend its reach to capture its prey and drag them into the depths of the waters below to consume them. After crossing the bridge safely, Heather finally finds a manhole to exit the underpass. While here, she ascends up a staircase to the top floor of the construction site to find that a homeless man was initially finding shelter here. Given the mass of littered food and drinks and props to emulate that of a home, with a nearby mattress, Heather uses this as a soft landing pad to drop down below safely from the 5th floor to the 3rd floor. From here, she navigates the scaffold to enter the Hilltop Center office building. Entering the Hilltop Center, Heather explores the interiors of the hallways that connect to neighboring office spaces. In one of these rooms, she finds a room filled with mannequins, giving a creepy and eerie vibe. As she inspects one of the mannequins on one side of the room, she hears a loud scream on the other side, finding that one of the mannequins' head fell off, leaking blood from the exposed neck. After this disturbing scene, Heather makes her way to an office that has a locked drawer containing a rope. Heather must then ascend the staircase to the 5th floor to KMN Auto Parts to acquire the jack. On the same floor, Heather eventually finds a screwdriver, which is needed to unlock the drawer containing the rope. With the rope and jack, Heather goes to the slightly open elevator on the 3rd floor. Here, she needs to combine both items to pry open the elevator doors and use the rope to scale down safely to the 2nd floor. On the 2nd floor, Heather enters Echo Interiors and Floor Fashions, where inside, she enters the storeroom, which contains an oddly placed bathtub. Curious, Heather decides to inspect the bathtub and turns on the water faucet to see the faucet pour out blood until the bathtub is full. Simultaneously, Heather experiences the headaches and cramps she experienced earlier upon first meeting Claudia. It's likely that Heather, over time, is experiencing the resurgences of the memories of her past self as Alessa Gillespie, while also the ever-growing embryonic god that lies dormant inside of her, as her cramps are reminiscent of contractions, or more specifically, the menstrual cycle before pregnancy, preparing for potential fertilization and implantation. With this overwhelming scenario that plays out, Heather falls unconscious. Moments later, Heather awakens in the Otherworld Hilltop Center. Exploring the Otherworld Hilltop Center, Heather enters a neighboring room. In this room, Heather finds a mysterious photo that depicts her, captured by someone stalking Heather. In this photograph, it says, "Find the Holy One, kill her." After inspecting the ominous photo, Heather enters a room where she meets Vincent Smith sitting alone in a chair awaiting her presence. A prominent figure in the cults, given his role of the priest, Vincent is rather unpredictable when it comes to his moral compass, as his intentions are uncertain, given his inquisitive nature, as he can be viewed as either an ally or an enemy. Vincent is described as a hypocrite behind nice clothes and a neat appearance by Shingo Yuri. Further elaborating on his claim, we can find Vincent to come off as emotionally manipulative, smug, cocky, and malicious. While a priest for the order, Vincent is anything but a religious figure, rather, adopting an atypical approach to the idea of God, as he is often seen openly mocking and lambasting the religion's virtues and ideals. His hypocrisy is exposed as he uses his position of power and authority for his personal gain, such as seeking out financial profit to extort money from the followers by manipulating them, sugarcoating this with an excuse that it's due to financial concerns. Not much is known about Vincent's early life, but it can be speculated that Vincent had some form of relationship, presumably a begrudging friendship with Claudia. This is seen as evident when Vincent is first seen interacting with her, mentioning her father, Leonard Wolf, as he reminisces about the painful memories of him witnessing, as a child, Leonard violently abusing Claudia. Other than this traumatizing memory he mentions, it's unknown of Vincent's earlier years, but he was likely indoctrinated into the cult, whether through forceful means or willingly, given his eventual role as the priest of the order. Upon first introduction, Vincent introduces himself after Heather questions who he is. He comes off as friendly in his tone in an attempt to persuade Heather that he is on her side. However, Heather, not easily manipulated as she is independent and self-aware of a person's intentions, given her previous hostile encounters of stalkers, doesn't take Vincent's introduction for the faint of heart. Questioning him, Heather assumes that Vincent is working with Claudia. Enraged by her assumption of his intentions, Vincent lashes out by stating he wants nothing to do with Claudia, as she was, in his words, brainwashed by that crazy old hag, referring to Dahlia Gillespie. Vincent implies that the crazy old lady was her mother after all. Confused, Heather mentions she has no recollection or prior knowledge of this woman being her mother. Taken aback, Vincent confides in this lack of knowledge by Heather by connecting this back to Harry Mason, assuming Harry likely never mentioned Dahlia Gillespie as her mother in an attempt to protect Heather from knowing her association with the Order. Vincent states that he knows about Heather's past and is surprised to learn that Heather is unaware. Because Vincent knows much about this information, Heather urges him to share how she can put an end to all of this as she feels like she's going crazy. Vincent, being emotionally depraved, asks her why she doesn't enjoy the events occurring as this place gets to him, finding it most fascinating. Disgusted by his reaction and lack of concern, Heather leaves to figure out how to put an end to all of this on her own. After exiting the room with Vincent, Heather finds a shelf containing the Oxidol, which will be one of 3 items needed for the Flame Purifies All puzzle. Continuing her exploration in the Otherworld Hilltop Center, Heather is introduced to the next monster, known as the Slurper, a crawling, humanoid creature wearing a pig-like mask with a long, pointy snout. The Slurper frequently crawls on floors to await its prey, to then rush them and climb on top of them to slurp them, as the name implies. While they're smaller in scale, they are highly deceptive and intelligent, using their sensitivity to sound to be alerted by nearby prey to know of their location, attacking their prey by grabbing onto them or overwhelming them by knocking them down. Oftentimes, Heather will likely need to remain passive and calm by turning off the flashlight and walking cautiously to not provoke the Slurpers. In the Lost Memories Silent Hill Chronicle, it states that the Slurper is derived from its habit of slurping up rusted colored blood and flesh off the floor with its pointed, long mask. While their interpretation is rather vague, leaving up to speculation behind the symbolic representation they adopt, the Slurper is likely rooted in sexual undertones. With a resemblance to a male in its humanoid-like appearance, the Slurper has a tendency to surprise Heather to then force themselves upon her in a very suggestive position. Because of Heather's fear of stalkers and predators, it's likely that this is manifested and projected into reality as an attempt to overwhelm her by exploiting the subconscious thoughts of rape or sexual assault. Passing the Slurpers, Heather takes an elevator to the first floor. Here, she encounters the Glutton, a massive monster that is littered with rot and decay, trapped in a cylindrical cage, with the mouths comprising the head and the chest. While the monster violently shakes and contorts in its movements, seeming hostile, it poses no threat nor harm when interacting. The Glutton is derived from the fairy tale book that Heather collects throughout the different floors of the Otherworld Hilltop Center, called Tu Fui Ego Eres. The Glutton is reminiscent of the creature in the tale that gobbles up the knights and villagers who attempt to leave their village. This is likely symbolic of Alessa Gillespie wanting to seek freedom from her captivity of being confined to a hospital bed for 7 years. Nearby on the first floor is a cafe which contains a pork liver inside a refrigerator, the second item needed for the Flame Purifies All puzzle. Heather re-enters the elevator to ascend to the 5th floor. On this floor, Heather navigates to the KMN Auto Parts to retrieve the final item needed, the matchbook. With all materials in her possession, Heather heads to the Gallery of Fine Arts. Inside the room is a mural titled Flame Purifies All, a depiction of the Order's god, which is hailed and worshipped by surrounding members, featuring a painting of Alessa Gillespie in the center. On the 4th floor, Heather stumbles upon a room with a silver coin. Inside the same room, near the back corner, rests a vending machine. Heather inserts the silver coin into the slot of the vending machine, receiving a life insurance key. With the life insurance key, Heather heads for the 1st floor to find the Glutton now completely gone after reading the final page of the fairy tale, using the life insurance key to exit the Otherworld Office Center. Outside, Heather navigates the city streets and alleyways to her home, Daisy Villa Apartments. Unlocking the door to her apartment, she lets out a huge sigh of relief, claiming to Harry that she made it home safely, but encountered something strange that was going on. Before Heather can give a second thought, she abruptly finds a horrifying sigh of her father, Harry, brutally murdered, with a pierced hole in his chest, remaining lifeless as his corpse rests on the chair, as he was likely awaiting Heather to return home safely. Confused, scared, and utterly devastated at the harrowing sight resting before her. Heather cries out and wallows in pain as she grieves for her father. After some time grieving, Heather takes a moment to look outside the apartment balcony, finding a bloody trail leading up the stairs to the rooftop. Filled with rage and vengeance, Heather rushes upstairs in hopes of finding the culprit who killed Harry. On the rooftop, Heather is shocked and confused to find none other than Claudia awaiting her. With this confrontation, with rage yet confusion, she questions if Claudia killed Harry. Claudia reveals that the reason she had Harry murdered was due to 17 years ago, when Harry prevented a ritual from completion that was supposed to see the birth of God, because Harry killed the incubus, putting an end to the ritualistic ceremony. But more importantly, the death of Alessa, her best friend. Claudia grew vengeful and bitter out of Harry's actions, seeing Harry adopting the reincarnation of Cheryl as kidnapping her from the cults. However, another reason for Harry's murder was due to Claudia wanting Heather to be consumed with hatred. Hatred that would be bestowed upon the fetus that lies dormant inside of her, to fill it with a form of emotion, specifically empathy. Before departing, Claudia tells Heather to remember her past self so she can deliver the birth of God to build an eternal paradise. Before Heather can kill Claudia with her handgun, the true culprit who murdered Harry reveals himself as the Missionary. A tall, humanoid monster, the Missionary seems talented enough to comprehend direct orders from Claudia, such as being ordered to fight Heather and apprehend her. With these human-like qualities, the monster has a burlap sack it wears over its head and a noose around its neck, a surgeon's smock, and rubber gloves stained with blood. As its weapon of choice, it holds two tonfa-like blades, which he uses to run directly towards Heather to slash her, and manifesting superhuman reflexes to counter Heather's gunfire, deflecting bullets from it. As the name suggests, the Missionary simulates that of a member in a religious group sent to promote its faith or provide services in hopes of enlightening those with indoctrinating their virtues and beliefs. In the Latin translation of the Bible, Jesus Christ sends his disciples to others to preach the gospel in his name. Likewise, it could be interpreted that Claudia, a high priestess in the cults, is appointing the Missionary to enlighten and indoctrinate Heather into the cults. Although, through violent and hostile efforts, the apparel of the Missionary expresses the surgeon-like attire with a surgeon's smock, rubber gloves of blood, and two sharp tonfa-like blades, the themes of forced pregnancy. In childbirth, in some circumstances, there's a method when conceiving a child called cervical dilation, a method involving the surgical removal of a fetus due to the uterus being incapable of pushing out the fetus naturally. This not only applies to childbirth, but also to miscarriage and induced abortion. This connects to Heather's unwillingness to comply with the order and giving birth to the god, resulting in the Missionary conducting a forced pregnancy, serving as an allegory of this theme. With the death of the Missionary, Heather returns to the apartment to find Douglas inspecting Harry's corpse with utter dismay and a loss for words. With not knowing what to say, Heather tells Douglas to not say anything and to leave her to herself to grieve. Trying not to escalate the situation, Douglas tells Heather to calm down. However, this backfires as Heather, given the circumstances, is rapidly experiencing complex emotions as her father was murdered. Before leaving, Heather and Douglas look at Harry's corpse, covered with a sheet as he rests in his bed, with flowers that lie atop his chest and a small burial to mourn for his passing. With a moment of silence, Douglas breaks the ice by asking Heather what she will do now. Heather herself admits that she isn't entirely sure. However, she does plan to go to Silent Hill to uncover her past memories that she's been trying to piece together and finally kill Claudia to avenge her father's death. With this information in mind, Douglas asks Heather how she plans to get to Silent Hill, given her lack of transportation. While initially not needing his help, likely to not burden him with her problems and potentially getting in danger, Douglas offers Heather to drive her to Silent Hill, mostly due in part to him feeling guilty and partially responsible for getting Heather into this ordeal. After Heather pays her respects and says goodbye to her father, she recuperates with Douglas to head off to Silent Hill. Before driving off to Silent Hill, Douglas tells Heather that he was approached by a man named Vincent Smith. From word of mouth, Vincent told Douglas to have him and Heather drive to West Southville to meet a man named Leonard. Douglas then gives Heather Harry's memo that he wrote to Heather before he died, called Simple Works. Hours later, Heather and Douglas are seen driving in the middle of the woods as they drive to Silent Hill on the brink of night. Breaking the quiet atmosphere with small talk, Douglas reminisces about Silent Hill, mentioning that he recalls a time when Silent Hill was a nice, quiet little town. During his early years, when he was still recruited as a police officer, he was called in on a missing persons case located in Silent Hill. However, much to his disappointment, he never solved the case till this day. Heather reveals she grew up in Silent Hill, much to Douglas's confusion, as he thought she originally grew up in Portland. As Heather tries to uncover these lost memories, she simultaneously has a painful headache. Heather comments she learned about this information after reading her father's memo, which contains a backstory explaining Heather's origin. Heather continues to explain that her mother is named Dahlia Gillespie and that she forced her daughter, Alessa Gillespie, her past life, into subjecting herself as a surrogate mother who would give birth to God. Furthermore, she continues to explain that Alessa was born with special powers due to her being born through supernatural means by her mother through occult magic. With this, she was granted telekinetic powers. Her classmates, growing aware of this, teased and rumored her as a witch. At the end of those events, the incubus, God, was killed by her father, Harry Mason. With this knowledge, Heather connects this to Claudia's plans to orchestrate a plot to sacrifice Heather, by using her as a surrogate mother to birth a new god, succeeding where Dahlia failed. Heather finishes her thoughts by lamenting how Alessa, before she died, gave the reincarnation of Cheryl to Harry to ensure that he gave her a healthy, loving, and happy life. With this thought, Heather regrets not saying to Harry how happy he made her before he died. On the next day, Heather and Douglas rest in room 106 of Jack's Inn. Before departing, the pair make a plan to go their separate ways to search for Leonard. Douglas tells Heather he'll pursue a search for Leonard at his residence. Meanwhile, Heather will further the search for Leonard at Brookhaven Hospital. Leaving the motel room, Heather then navigates Silent Hill through the thick, layered fog of West Southville, needing to head past a bowling alley, Pete's Bolorama, and a nightclub, Heaven's Night. Eventually, Heather finds Brookhaven Hospital. Inside the hospital, Heather finds a visiting room that contains a mysterious and oddly placed doll, alongside a journal. Curious, Heather reads this journal to find it contains a love poem addressed to Heather. In this poem, a man by the name of Stanley Coleman professes the love he radiates for Heather, despite hardly knowing her. He states that he waited in his cell for a long time, longing for the day Heather would come to rescue him. Stanley tells Heather he loves her, and, as a gift, gives her the prized doll as a commemoration of their meeting and producing this everlasting love forever. Disgusted and recoiled by this unforeseen and disturbing poem, alongside the doll specifically given to her, Heather finds Stanley's efforts to be creepy and uncomfortable, as she doesn't know the person and rejects his advances. Throughout the exploration of Brookhaven Hospital, on subsequent appearances, Heather will discover more of Stanley's advances in proclaiming his love to Heather, with various poems he has scattered around the hospital for her to find. Even though Heather does take notice and read these poems, she cements her feelings of this as borderline creepy and disturbing, not wanting anything to do with this mysterious stalker. In the final poem that Stanley leaves for Heather, he accepts this delusional reality where he idolizes Heather as his perfect partner for himself, telling her goodbye in this final poem. While he professes his wishes to live a life with her in a perfect, beautiful world where it's just them alone, he is incapable of seeing this through with Heather due to Leonard, stating, "Leonard despises me because I made fun of it, saying it would become this. If it weren't for his meddling, I would have been able to meet you in just a little while." Stanley bids his farewells, ending his poem with Heather as his goddess and lover. As to what or who Stanley Coleman is left up to interpretation. It's possible that Stanley Coleman is the spirit of an actual person who passed away, as it's revealed in his notes that he was a patient who resided in one of the cell rooms in Brookhaven Hospital. Stanley was diagnosed with and suffers from attachment disorder, a psychological disturbance in which someone obsesses over a person or an inanimate object. Stanley's symptoms express sexual and emotional attachment towards Heather, seeing her as his lover, yet simultaneously an object of lust and love. With this in mind, Stanley can be deduced to idolize and romanticize the idea of Heather as opposed to genuine emotional and romantic love, due to his mental disorder, incapable of distinguishing the two concepts. Another interpretation of Stanley is that he is the manifestation derived from Heather's subconscious as one of her fears she expresses, which are stalkers or predators that she likely had experienced at some point in her pubescence. This is supported by reactions towards people's direct and forward nature, exacting something from her. Heather, in a way, can be seen as an object that people take advantage of. To Claudia, a sacrifice and birthing god. To Vincent, a victim who is manipulated into doing his bidding. And to Douglas, a reminder of the death of his son, which he takes as an opportunity to appease his guilty conscience over his death by helping Heather. After reading the memo left by Stanley, Heather is met with one of the monsters roaming the halls of Brookhaven Hospital, called the Nurse. Much like the bubblehead nurses previously seen in Silent Hill 2 or puppet nurses in Silent Hill 1, the nurses in Silent Hill 3 emulate that of proportions of a humanoid creature, lack notable, distinctive qualities such as a bubblehead or parasite on their back. Rather, they adopt a human-like appearance wearing a white nurse's uniform, black bob haircut, eyeshadow, and lipstick. However, one ominous feature is the red square that closes their mouth shut. Furthermore, they're equipped with a revolver or pipe, expressing a hostile nature. According to Lost Memories Silent Hill Chronicle, it's speculated that the nurses were, at some point, likely to be humans transformed into monsters. The common misconception of the nurses is that they're related to the bubblehead nurses, as they share a familial appearance, aesthetically speaking, alluding to the idea that they're connected. However, Masahiro Ito corrects this by stating that while the bubblehead nurses and puppet nurses are used as inspiration, they are by no means connected, as each monster is separate from a specific protagonist who is called upon the town of Silent Hill. The nurse is a manifestation derived from Alessa's memories under the treatment of recovering from her wounds after being burned, taken care of and watched over by her caretaker, Lisa Garland. The red square attached to the nurse's mouth is meant to represent the shrieking insanity that was internalized in Alessa as she suffered 7 long years of pain and agony, living in a body that was mutilated beyond repair. This embodies Alessa's internal mental turmoil as the trauma of her bullying from her classmates and Dahlia's physical abuse tormenting her manifested into the nurses to visually express this pain and trauma she suffered. As Heather traverses the decrepit corridors of Brookhaven Hospital, she finds room C4. Inside the room, Heather finds a key that is stuck to a wall, much like the surrounding inanimate objects. Because of this, she explores the neighboring rooms to eventually find the nail polish remover in the woman's locker room on the 2nd floor. With the nail polish remover, Heather can access the key stuck to the wall she previously visited. Before doing so, Heather first solves the puzzle of the 2nd floor patient wing keypad. When solved, she enters room M4 towards the end of the hallway. In this room, Heather must solve the dead man's briefcase puzzle, requiring her to use the clock resting on the desk to solve the 4-digit code to unlock the briefcase. When solved, she acquires the instant camera. Returning to the 1st floor patient wing of room C4, Heather uses the nail polish remover to remove the stairwell key stuck to the wall. With the stairwell key, Heather descends into the basement, finding a storeroom in which she uses the instant camera to take a photo of the wall hidden behind debris. When the instant camera finishes processing the photo, she finds a 4-digit code to unlock the 3rd floor patient wing. In the 3rd floor patient wing, Heather stumbles upon room S12, which contains a telephone sitting on a desk. Inside the room, Heather suddenly hears the telephone ringing. Picking up the phone, Heather is greeted with silence on the other end of the line. Breaking the tension, Heather says hello. Before she can speak another word, Heather is interrupted by a man's voice that laments about Claudia's behavior, demanding her to apologize for how foolish her dream is to birth a god, by cleansing humankind to seek an eternal paradise. Heather interrupts the man by clarifying that she is not Claudia and her name is Heather. Heather asks the man who he is, only to be revealed as Leonard Wolf, and that Claudia is his daughter. Heather tells Leonard, with hesitation, that she plans to kill Claudia. Surprisingly, Leonard seems rather calm and collected, given the fact that Heather wants to kill his own daughter. Heather gives her reasoning behind her intentions, as Claudia willingly killed her father, giving her justification for her act of revenge. While understanding her position, Leonard still acknowledges that Claudia is his daughter by blood, reasoning with Heather to stop her act in killing Claudia. Leonard offers to help her stop Claudia if she frees him from captivity. Agreeing, Leonard instructs Heather to head to the end of the hallway to room M on the 2nd floor patient wing. With this information, Heather heads to the mysterious door to enter a labyrinth of paths that confuse Heather in her progression in navigating the maze-like area. After some time navigating the labyrinth, Heather eventually finds a red symbol depicting the seal of Metatron, the talisman Leonard was referring to earlier in the phone call. When approaching the red symbol, Heather gets a brief flashback to Lisa Garland on a videotape, lamenting about her internal struggle with her morality and caretaking Alessa as she confesses she's terrified of her supernatural abilities, such as her ability to physically survive wounds that should have killed her. After this flashback, Heather finds a room with a ladder that ascends upwards, which she needs to climb. While climbing the ladder, Heather finds herself in a transition into the otherworld Brookhaven Hospital. On the 3rd floor patient wing, Heather searches through the blood-infested hallways and eventually stumbles upon a room with a large mirror. In this room, there's a large and massive mirror that sits on the wall in front of her, allowing Heather to see all of herself in this reflection. If Heather chooses to stay in this room, the room will slowly become corrupted and impure as time passes. Drenched in red, black-like veins that covers the floors, walls, ceiling, and finally, Heather herself on the opposite side of the mirror. Eventually, Heather will finally be consumed by the red, black-like veins, leading her to dying. The mirror room is likely used as an allegory to represent one of the many fears Heather exhibits throughout the story. Having a fear of mirrors, called spectrophobia, in this context, sees a woman in their adolescent teenage years derived from their insecurities in their physical appearance, which exposes their flaws as they can see all of themselves in this reflection. Mirrors were previously seen at the beginning of the story, where Heather encountered the Hail of the Sun symbol. Nearby the symbol, Heather looks at herself in the mirror, giving direct commentary as she stares at her reflection, expressing her dislike of mirrors as she doesn't like her appearance, hinting at dysphoria. There's also the likelihood of this serving as symbolism to Alessa Gillespie. It's possible that when Heather looked into the Hail of the Sun, her memories started to come back to her, albeit slowly. In these shattered memories, she starts to manifest the past life of Alessa. With Alessa's traumatic memories, this likely influenced her dislike of staring at herself in the mirror, possibly seeing herself as a disease or a burden. After witnessing the large mirror room, Heather takes the elevator to the second-floor patient wing, entering the men's locker room to find a locker that holds a payphone. As she inspects the payphone, the telephone abruptly starts to ring. With hesitation, Heather picks up the phone and asks who it is. On the other end, Heather hears an eerie and chilling voice that sings her a happy birthday song. Confused, Heather asks if this is Leonard. The happy birthday caller tells her that's the murderer's name, and that he isn't her beloved Stanley either. The happy birthday caller continues with this delusional call about Heather's birthday. However, Heather corrects this by stating it isn't her birthday. The caller is likely referring to Heather's past lives, specifically Alessa and Cheryl. The caller wishes her a happy 24th and 31st birthday. If they were still alive, Cheryl Mason would be 24 years old, and Alessa Gillespie would be 31 years old. After the phone call, Heather enters the women's locker room and finds a plastic bag inside a trash can. With a plastic bag, Heather uses the elevator to ascend to the third-floor patient wing to fill the plastic bag with blood. With this item, Heather uses the elevator to ascend to the basement crematorium. Here, she must solve a puzzle with nearby hospital gurneys, which have red numbers marked on the bedsheets. With these numbers, she deduces the correct locker combination code. When solved, she receives the cremated key. With the cremated key, Heather finds herself on the first-floor patient wing. Continuing down the hall into room C4, Heather finds an altar with items that are placed for a ritual. Heather places the plastic bag with blood onto the altar and drenches it with blood to commence the ritual. Once completed, Heather sees the floor reveal a hidden passageway with a ladder leading down below to meet Leonard Wolf. Heather descends the ladder to find a large room filled with muddy, putrid water. Here, Heather finally meets Leonard. However, much to her dismay, Heather finds out while Leonard is in opposition to Claudia's plans to bring an eternal paradise through her methods, he still is one to seek out the salvation for the paradise they prophesize. Heather, apathetic to the man's plans and clearly not showing interest in the belief or ideals of the cults, gives Leonard the wrong impression, and he becomes offended by her lack of care, seeing her as a non-believer. Caught in this delusional state of mind, Leonard believes Heather deceived him, solely to gain the seal of Metatron for herself to destroy God. Heather clarifies that she wasn't trying to trick him, rather believed they had a miscommunication about each other's intentions. Even though Heather tries her best to be rational and communicate with Leonard with the best intentions, Leonard is too clouded by his judgment. Leonard reveals himself to be a transformed monster and engages in a battle with Heather. In his true form, Leonard appears reptilian-like, covered with a disease-ridden, yellow skin-like appearance, with his body heavily mutilated beyond recognition. Leonard uses sharp, blade-like tendrils for his hands to slash and inflict damage on Heather, and if he's damaged, uses the underwater environment to his advantage, as he appears amphibious, having the ability to roam underwater for long, indefinite periods without drowning. In his past, Leonard Wolf was another follower of the cults, the Order, and immersed not only himself, but also his daughter forcefully, Claudia Wolf, into the Order's religious practices and sermons, whether she was willing or not. If Claudia were to show irreligious behavior, he'd lash out in anger and physically beat her. Throughout the many years of physical abuse, Claudia's religious and physical trauma consumed her, converting her into the cults, eventually assuming the position of the high priestess of the order. Because Alessa and Claudia were best friends in their youth, it's possible Leonard was an acquaintance of Dahlia Gillespie, but as to what the relationship was is unknown. At some point when he was much older, Leonard was institutionalized at Brookhaven Hospital. He was stripped of his position in the cult due to his erratic and aggressive behavior that was potentially seen as a threat or danger to others. Furthering this study of Leonard's behavior, a doctor's note evaluating Leonard's mental state documented that Leonard is cooperative and has a strong passion for justice, however, can easily become violent and hostile when overexcited or deeply upset, such as the staff expressing their opposition towards his enforced religious practices upon them without their consent. The doctor also notes Leonard displaying mild hallucinations, emotional instability, and obsessive ideas, concluding that Leonard potentially suffers from schizophrenia. It's unknown as to what or how Leonard became corrupted with his transformation to his monster form, or if he's even a monster at all, given his seemingly normal tone when he communicates with Heather, as he seemingly has the ability to have intelligible speech. After a long, arduous battle, Heather finally kills Leonard, seeing herself transported back to Brookhaven Hospital, where she finds the seal of Metatron. Elsewhere, back at Jackson, we see an argument unfold between Claudia and Vincent. Claudia is enraged that Vincent sent Heather to kill Leonard. In his response, Vincent mocks her in a smug tone, implying that with Leonard's death, he was sent to God in the afterlife. Although Claudia is visibly upset about her father's death, Vincent exposes her hypocrisy when he openly reveals her past trauma of Leonard's physical abuse he committed towards her. Furthering his point, Vincent exploits Claudia's quote-unquote faith as nothing more than a victimized child regressing and wanting to cry out for love, in hopes of having a loving relationship with her father that she never had. Claudia's orchestration of the birth of God is possibly her using this as a means to cope with her trauma by birthing a God with empathy through pain and suffering, which will encompass morality and emotion, unlike her father, who never displayed that for her. Shortly after, Claudia leaves Vincent to himself, and moments later, Heather arrives in the motel room to meet Vincent. Vincent relays a message to Heather from Douglas, telling her to meet him at the church on the other side of Toluca Lake to stop Claudia. Before arriving at the church, Heather must first navigate through Lakeside Amusement Park. Arriving at Lakeside Amusement Park, Heather suddenly experiences another bout of painful cramps, alluding to the fetus inside of her, preparing to eventually be born. Nearby, Heather finds a souvenir shop called Sweet Factory Store. Inside, she hears a sudden crash, and she finds inside one of the boxes a roller coaster key. With this, Heather heads towards the mountain coaster to use the roller coaster key to access the control room. Inside the control room, she presses a button that deactivates the roller coaster ride so that it doesn't kill her. Walking along the roller coaster tracks, Heather experiences deja vu as she hears an oncoming roller coaster car heading towards her. Learning from her previous mistakes, she jumps off the roller coaster tracks, landing on a ticket booth. Elsewhere, we see Douglas confront Claudia. Claudia expresses frustration towards Douglas for his inability to deliver Heather to her, as he was specifically hired to do so. However, Douglas expresses his anger at Claudia as she lied and used him without revealing her true intentions. Claudia defends herself by stating that Heather was technically born in Silent Hill and was merely kidnapped by Harry Mason, brainwashed into believing that she was happy with him. However, Douglas counters this accusation as he was told by Heather herself that this is false, as Heather expressed love for her father and wants nothing to do with the cults. After, Douglas equips his handgun, aiming directly at Claudia with the full intent of killing her. However, Claudia isn't fazed by his actions and is rather disappointed, pitying Douglas for his inability to see her vision for the birth of paradise in this new world she plans. Meanwhile, Heather wakes up atop the ticket booth after her fall. Realizing she's alive and well, she jumps off and continues her progression in finding Douglas. Making her way through the amusement park, Heather stumbles upon Borley Haunted Mansion. Inside, she experiences a simulated haunted attraction, hearing a voice over the intercom with a creepy narration. In the rooms to follow, Heather experiences a room with a hanging corpse, a spiked death trap, and a long liminal hallway, depicting a labyrinth. In this labyrinth, Heather must navigate through the maze-like hallways whilst simultaneously running from a bright red glowing light that kills her if she fails to evade its presence. Upon successfully escaping the maze, Heather re-enters the amusement park grounds. Exploring more of the amusement park, Heather finds an amphitheater containing a red shoe in the middle of the stage and a chain sitting on top of one of the bleachers. With the chain, she latches it on a hook in the middle column of a ride and attaches it to the locked metal gates. Inside the control room, Heather turns on the swing rocket ride, which breaks open the lock of the metal gate door. Heather finally then recuperates of Douglas, finding him incapacitated with a wound on his right leg, left with no other choice but to sit down, immobilized, as he believes it's broken. Worried about Douglas, Heather responds by calling for an ambulance. Douglas, however, protests in favor of not calling for help and instead leaving him to his wounds. Frustrated by his actions, Heather calls him an old fool and asks why he would go out his way to help her. Douglas reveals the reason for helping Heather is because he sees, in essence, his son in Heather. Douglas tells Heather that a long time ago, likely before his wife divorced him and he retired from the police force, his son robbed a bank due to the family's financial concerns. During this robbery, his son was unfortunately caught in a crossfire with the cops and was killed in action. Because of this event, Douglas laments his son's actions, calling him a penniless good-for-nothing, but also blames himself for not stopping his son from committing this crime. To Douglas, he likely sees his act of helping Heather as appeasing his guilty conscience for his inability to save his son from his grim fate. With Heather, he sees her predicament as a second chance to make amends for his son's death by helping her stop Claudia from her evil plot. With this revelation, Heather sympathizes with Douglas as she too understands the feeling of losing someone she loved, her father, and wanting to make amends with the guilt and regret to appease her conscience. Heather calms Douglas and eases his worries by telling him to rest, as she'll put an end to this vendetta with the cult once and for all. In an act of impulsivity, Douglas quietly raises his handgun and aims it at Heather, internally struggling in his mind to justify his actions whether killing Heather here would end the sequence of events to come. However, Douglas backs down and lets his consciousness get the better of him. Afterward, Heather finds a fortune teller attraction which holds Douglas's notebook, containing a detailed document of information he gathered for the missing person's case he was initially hired by Claudia to search for, that person being Heather. Close by on a chair, there's a doll head that Heather picks up. Elsewhere, Heather finds a theme park attraction with two life-size dolls of Snow White and Cinderella. With Cinderella, Heather places the red shoe, and with Snow White, places the doll head. This unlocks the door to exit the attraction. Outside once again in the theme park, Heather finds an ice cream stand with a notepad that is shown to be Harry's notes he wrote down when he was previously at Lakeside Amusement Park 17 years ago. In these notes, we see Harry's internalized thoughts vocalized through his writings. After learning he was coerced by Dahlia into helping her stop the ritual Alessa was conducting, performing a ritualistic suicide to end her suffering and kill the god inside of her. Harry realizes he was tricked into believing Alessa was a demon and kidnaps Cheryl to use as a sacrifice. He remembers in the hospital basement that he saw a picture depicting Alessa who looked eerily similar to Cheryl, which causes him to feel empathy for Alessa, as she not only reminds him of Cheryl, but also because of her loss of innocence as she pleads to him for help. Finishing his thoughts, Harry's determined that he will save and rescue his daughter, Cheryl. After reading Harry's notes, Heather finds herself on the happy carousel. While here, Heather notices the horses spraying gas that will, over time, kill her, unless she kills all the horses before time runs out. After committing this act, Heather finds the happy carousel spinning faster, emulating a sequence of time passing. In this transition, we see a figure emerge from the darkness, revealing itself as the memory of Alessa, a bloody, corrupted, diseased doppelganger of Heather. The memory of Alessa serves as Alessa's dark and negative thoughts derived from her subconscious that she suppresses, manifested into reality. Much of the appearance of memory of Alessa shows mutilation marks, disease-ridden skin, decayed flesh, serving as allusions to Alessa's painful trauma of being burned alive and in solitary confinement for 7 years, suffering in agony. The memory of Alessa is a manifestation of Alessa's subconscious desires and thoughts that want to stop and kill the birth of God, to spare the world from suffering the same pain she felt, opting for a quick death, as it would not only stop the birth of God, but also allow her to die. This boss fight takes place on a carousel, which is symbolic of the halo of the sun, specifically the 3 outer rings, serving as a cycle of rebirth, representing past, present, and future. The environment speeds up rampantly once it's in motion, and it's never ending, symbolizing the passage of time that Alessa spent for years in her suffering and, metaphorically speaking, visualizing the never-ending pain she experienced. as the center of the carousel shows a burned figure constantly on fire. Tragically, the memory of Alessa believed that the only way to escape from her pain and suffering was death. Because Heather is a reincarnation of Alessa, Heather also shared these subconscious thoughts of death, believing that if she were to die herself, the series of events happening with the birth of the god, as well as the pain, trauma, and tragedy she and Alessa both feel, could finally end. However, the duality of these two bloodstained philosophies deviates with Heather coming to realize that by confronting memory of Alessa to kill her to not only end her pain and suffering, but rather come to the conclusion that the memories of this trauma will live on, and that in her death, it doesn't have to define her. Instead, choose to accept this inescapable past life and learn from it to move on to a better tomorrow. Putting an end to Alessa's pain, Heather leaves the happy carousel and arrives at the chapel, confronting Claudia. Heather, while aiming her handgun at Claudia, ready to kill her, indulges in Claudia's religious babbling to amuse her. While listening to Claudia's sermon on the resurrection of God, Heather imitates Alessa by pretending to be her, in hopes of potentially deterring Claudia from her plans, but also humoring herself. While Heather indulges in this act to hopefully persuade Claudia into retracting from her plans, she also sees it's virtually hopeless, as Claudia is infected into this belief of the ritual, as she believes the birth of God, cleansing the earth of hellfire to grant salvation to those who seek death, and be rebirthed anew, free of sin. Countering this argument, Heather affirms her viewpoint that suffering, while it brings pain and agony, is a way of life. As it's part of the human condition, we either learn to live with that pain and move on, or succumb to its torment and live a life filled with dread. In life, there is death, and in death, there is life. To Heather, this is a part of life as she understands that pain closely, as she experienced this in her past lives as Alessa and Cheryl, respectively. In gaining this perception, she acknowledges this experience and garners wisdom, learning she needs to move on and let go if she wants to start a new life without that pain and trauma. With this fortuitous back and forth between the two, Heather starts into her cramped state again as she falls to her knees in pain. As Claudia sees this, she grows pleased that the god within her is growing and sees that her hatred towards her is exacerbating this birth of God. As Claudia leaves, Heather picks up the first tarot card, the Eye of the Night, and explores the chapel. Close by in the next room, Heather finds a confession with a woman inside. As Heather steps inside, she listens to an unknown woman who confesses to Heather to forgive her, as she acknowledges the sins she committed, possibly referring to the heinous acts that the Order committed. Continuing with this repentance, the woman pleads to Heather to forgive her for her sins, as she would happily go to purgatory, but not wanting to go to hell. It's theorized that the woman in the confession is possibly a manifestation of Dahlia Gillespie. This is due to the words she uses, such as, "Deliver the soul of my poor murdered daughter," and "Care for the soul of the girl whose life I have taken." This is likely referring to her daughter, Alessa Gillespie, whom she sacrificed as a surrogate mother to birth God. The girl's life who was stolen refers to Cheryl Mason. After 7 long years of pain and suffering, Alessa had given up and was left with no other option but to use her astral projection to call out to Cheryl, who died the moment she rekindled the fair other half of her soul. In this act of humility, it's possible Dahlia's spirit hasn't necessarily learned from her mistakes and wrongdoings, but acknowledges that what she did was wrong and is suffering from those consequences, acting out in desperation to appease God, in hopes he would show mercy upon her soul. After Heather doesn't forgive the woman in the confessional, Heather navigates the corridors of the church to find a hallway with red footprints, with a young girl crying. These red footprints step towards the painting, which hint to Heather that she needs to interact with the painting. Once done, a hidden door is revealed. Before entering this mysterious door, Heather heads further down the hallway to the belfry. Inside, Heather notices 3 large paintings: Saint Jennifer Carroll, Saint Alessa Gillespie, and finally, Saint Nicholas. Jennifer Carroll is depicted as a historical figure back in the town of Sound Hill's early history. Jennifer Carroll became aware of the spiritual and supernatural nature the townsfolk were blind to. Curiosity got the best of her, and she indulged in these ritualistic practices or dark occult magic in secrecy. Because of these practices, she was eventually held captive and executed, purportedly by Christians due to political opposition. However, this could also be due to her, in the eyes of a Christian, being depicted as practicing witchcraft. Because of her death, the cult hailed her as a saint and a martyr, serving as potentially one of the sole influences in creating the Order. Alessa Gillespie is depicted as a saint, immortalized in this painting as a holy, divine figure. sacrificing her life to give birth to God. With this act, they hailed her as the Holy Mother, the one who would lead them to salvation, with the deity promising a new eternal paradise. The irony is that Alessa wanted nothing to do with the cults after the abuse and trauma they inflicted onto her. To cover up this truth, they manipulated Alessa into their image, giving this false illusion that she was willing to give birth to the Order's God and propagate the Order's mission of receiving paradise. Nicholas is depicted as a saint, particularly as the Doctor of God. While we don't have much information regarding Nicholas, we can speculate that Nicholas is likely seen as a caretaker in helping deliver God. This would be false, as Alessa wasn't impregnated through natural intercourse, rather through supernatural means. The reality is that God was delivered by the incubator, the combination of Alessa and the other half, Cheryl. This incubator is the combination of both those souls, which delivers the demonic entity masquerading as a false god, known as the incubus. After inspecting the paintings in the belfry, Heather makes her way through the church on the upper level, reaching the library to collect the Moon Tarot card. Once collected, Heather is interrupted by Vincent. Impatient as to whether she could trust Vincent or not, due to his unpredictable and mysterious nature, Heather confronts him as to whether he's working together with Claudia or truly helping her. Vincent admits that while they do believe in the same God, he has ulterior motives that don't align with Claudia's. Vincent claims that he doesn't want God to be born, as it wouldn't be convenient and unpredictable. Heather sees this as Vincent merely using her to manipulate his own selfish goals, which isn't any different than Claudia's. Vincent sugarcoats this as he doesn't possess the powers that Heather has, implying she possesses the same telekinesis powers that arrive from Alessa. Vincent proceeds to gaslight Heather into believing that she is as much in the wrong as he is, as he sees Heather's actions justifying this sick and twisted enjoyment when killing the monsters. Confused and unsettled by his comment, Heather asks if Vincent is referring to the monsters. Hearing this, Vincent questions Heather if the monsters she is killing are truly monsters to her, implying that she may not actually be killing monsters, but in actuality, real people. Given Vincent's manipulative and sadistic personality, it's possible that he's instigating Heather to provoke an emotion out of her, just for his twisted enjoyment. Before he leaves, Vincent suddenly remembers to ask Heather for the seal of Metatron, reassured to see that she has it still. He then gives Heather the Book of Otherworld Laws, a book that describes the effects and behavior of the otherworld. However, the page Heather flips to is the seal of Metatron to learn the magical properties of the talisman. This entry describes the seal of Metatron as a magic square with strong protective and dispelling properties, referred to as Virun 7 Crest, or the seal of Metatron. This talisman is purposed to bring results, regardless of whether the target is good or evil. However, the caster must possess the strength to emit this action, as it places a heavy burden on the user, as there's the possibility that it may or may not work, resulting in failure. The name Metatron is derived from the angel of the same name, rooted in Jewish mysticism, practiced and taught from the Kabbalah. Metatron is often described in Jewish folklore as a celestial scribe, documenting the sins and merits of man who worked under God as his mediator, or referred to more commonly as the agent of God. With this in mind, it's theorized that the seal, while undermined by Claudia for its lack of magical properties, referred to her as a piece of junk, isn't necessarily used for the source of its power, but rather amplifies existing power. This can be supported by Heather's pre-existing supernatural abilities and powers due to her connection to Alessa, such as her inspecting the seal of Metatron when she first retrieves it after killing Leonard. In doing so, she doesn't have a reaction which results in headaches or contractions. Furthermore, the magical properties are further supported by Alessa's usage of the talisman herself, specifically as a symbol to summon a ritual in which she would inflict utter annihilation on the town of Silent Hill. After her exchange with Vincent, Heather takes the elevator and descends to the lower level of the church. On this floor, Heather enters a door that leads to a mortuary. Inside, she discovers the third tarot card, the Hangman. Elsewhere down the hall is a room that is an exact replication of Harry's bedroom. Lying on the bed is a notebook left for Heather to read, titled Harry's Diary. In this transcript, Harry reveals he expressed doubts and worries about the reincarnated baby, Cheryl, being the reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie. Even though he encompassed these internal conflicts with himself, he undoubtedly expressed love and compassion for Cheryl, referring to her as his most beloved treasure. Although Harry seems to be at ease with his internal thoughts, he reserves for Cheryl's identity. He does, however, express his worries about whether or not he should open up and be honest about the truth of Cheryl's past, worried that either Heather would hate him for not revealing the truth of her birth or connection to the Order burdening her. Heather is instead humbled by this revelation, not holding any past judgment nor resentment toward her father, understanding that he's only human in the feelings he reserved about her, given his past traumatic events. With these writings, Heather understands that deep down, he truly loved and cared for her. After leaving the room, Heather encounters the next monster, known as the Scrapper. Similar in appearance and behavior to the Missionary, the Scrapper holds the same abilities as the Missionary, although much smaller and weaker, appearing as a medium-sized humanoid-like monster with a brown butcher's smock and sack over its head, wearing bloody rubber gloves and equipped with tonfa-like blades as its weapon, scraping together as it makes a sharp, ear-piercing sound with metal grinding. It's implied that the Scrappers may be followers of the cult, derived as monstrous manifestations from Claudia's subconscious, and how she potentially perceives her followers as tools and using them for her grand scheme of birthing the god and creating a new eternal paradise. Because the Scrapper has a similar resemblance to the Missionary, it's likely meant to torment Heather as a reminder of the monster that killed her father, given its appearance the moment after she reads Harry's diary. Following this encounter with the Scrapper, she furthers her journey to the lower level of the chapel, entering a hallway to find a disturbing scene of two female bodies side by side, hanging from a contraption as their bodies are draped over by a curtain, only revealing their legs and feet. These two girls are meant to serve as connections to Alessa and Cheryl. Underneath these bodies is a monster that we've seen recurringly in the background, known as Valtiel. One of the more unique monsters, Valtiel is distinct from the other monsters in-game as he remains completely passive, as opposed to the more aggressive and hostile nature. This is because Valtiel serves as the attendant of God, depicted as one of God's angels, whose sole purpose is to help oversee the birth of God. The Order believes that Valtiel is instrumental to the religious practices and rituals they conduct, even devoting a religious sector titled the Valtiel Sector. The Valtiel Sector served under the belief that Valtiel was a saint who corresponded to that of an angel who served under God, believing that Valtiel was connected and derived from the figure in Jewish mysticism known as Metatron, often described as the highest of angels with various roles including celestial scribe and mediator between God and humanity, serving as the guide and speaker for God to lead humanity to salvation in his presence. Valtiel's power is so vast and immense that he's implied to retain the properties of resurrection. If Heather were to die, there's a possibility to see a unique and rare cutscene of Heather lying down, incapacitated or diseased. We see Valtiel come to her aid and take her to presumably a passive and safer area to resurrect Heather. Valtiel isn't necessarily deemed as a guardian or protector of Heather per se, but rather the fetus growing inside of her, that of course being God. Upon witnessing Valtiel, Heather furthers her journey. In the room close by, Heather finds a basement with a hospital bed, a reconstruction of the memories Alessa retained from her 7 long years of being confined to a hospital bed. After recollecting these painful memories, Heather receives the 4th tarot card, the Fool. Leaving the room, Heather navigates the rest of the lower level to find a recreation of her childhood room in her past life as Alessa. Inside her room, we see a butterfly collection, scribbled drawings, and the drawing block book. Sitting on her desk is Harry's final memo. Before he confronted Dahlia and fought the incubus, Harry vocalized his internalized thoughts once again, aware of Alessa beyond this room as he can sense her presence. However, this time he feels something sickening and dangerous, assuming it's God. However, through the sheer will of a father's love for his daughter, Harry attempts to fully save both of them, referring to Alessa and Cheryl. After reading Harry's final memo, Heather finds the brass key, which she uses on the locked door on the upper floor of the chapel. Unlocking this area of the chapel, Heather finds another recreation derived from Alessa's memories that is of her classroom from her time at Midwich Elementary School. In this classroom, we see her desk secluded and left alone in the middle, scribbles carved deeply into the wooden desk, such as "Go home," "Drop dead," and "Thief." Nearby on the teacher's desk is Alessa's homeroom teacher, Kay Gordon, notebook documenting Alessa's bullying from her classmates, as well as suspicions of her mother's physical abuse. She notes that she's reserved with her speculation and will not cooperate by furthering this investigation, believing it will resolve in due time. However, her conscience pushes her into providing help for Alessa, such as consulting a lawyer to resolve this dispute. Although, nothing ever came of this. Leaving the classroom, Heather finds the final tarot card, High Priestess, in Claudia's room. With the final tarot card, Heather reconvenes in Alessa's bedroom to solve the tarot card door puzzle. Once solved, Heather makes her final descent towards the pathway leading to the double doors. Inside, Claudia and Vincent are seen arguing about their clashing bloodstained philosophies when it comes to the interpretation of God. For Vincent, it's endorsing himself with riches and financial gain, as it reveals he built much of the church with his position and power, reaping much of the financial profits donated to the cults. It's likely that Vincent, being the hypocrite he is, used his supposed belief in this god and his devotion to the cult as a means to manufacture and extort the profits for himself. Not to say Vincent didn't initially believe in the cult's practices or teachings during his upbringing, but because of his research and studies in the books he indulges in, such as philosophy or theology, he gains valuable knowledge and high intelligence to use for his selfish gains by exploiting the church for his desires. To Claudia, she sees the value in the birth of God as a means of reaching salvation, reconciling and repenting for humanity's endless sin and failure, to learn from their misdeeds and wrongdoings. In juxtaposition to Dahlia's intentions for empowerment with the creation of a new world in her image, Claudia is genuine in her plot to see humankind rebirth without pain and suffering. The irony is that pain and suffering is needed as it will allow for humanity to gain empathy and morality from its sin, leading to a perfect internal paradise. Furthering this irony is that both Vincent and Claudia point out the hypocrisy in their plans in seeking this fruition but refuse to acknowledge the flaws and inconsistencies in their agenda. As both Claudia and Vincent continue to argue, Heather abruptly arrives. Vincent, pleased to see Heather, tells her to kill Claudia. However, much to his surprise, Claudia kills Vincent by stabbing him in the back with a dagger. Heather confronts Claudia, with Claudia expressing her dismay for Heather not confiding in her plot to rebirth God. Heather, finally frustrated and through with Claudia's delusional plans, tells her that a perfect paradise cannot be born through hatred. Claudia, stubborn and refeeding from this claim, tells Heather that a god born from this hatred will garner empathy. Claudia then admits that while her intentions were for the betterment of humankind, she does acknowledge that she will go to hell for all the pain, sacrifice, and suffering she caused for her plan to work. Vincent, with his last dying breath, tells Heather to use the seal of Metatron to stop Claudia. However, Claudia scoffs at Vincent as she reveals that the seal of Metatron is nothing more than a piece of junk. Soon after, Heather gets contractions as the god inside of her is close to being born. In a last-ditch effort, Heather grabs the pendant that Harry gave her, revealing that the red liquid inside is Glutton. Heather then swallows the liquid to exorcise the fetus inside of her, seeing her vomit it out. As Heather is about to kill the fetus, Claudia, out of desperation, swallows the fetus. Afterward, she's seen slowly contracting in pain as she gives birth to God, seeing her fall through a hole in the ground. This violent imagery symbolizes a ruptured vaginal introitus, simulating the vaginal tears of a violent and traumatic birth. Heather jumping down the hole to kill God can be seen as a metaphor for abortion, as she aborts the baby by killing God. Once down the hole, Heather witnesses God in all of its horrifying glory. Valtiel is seen unwrapping the god with a blanket sheet, revealing an appearance that adopts similarities to that of Alessa Gillespie. It's possible that the collective conscious thought of the cult members derived the idolization of their god as Alessa. In the Order's corrupted image of Alessa, they devoted their love and worshipped her as the mother who sacrificed her life to give birth to God. However, even if the intentions are pure, God is perceived as demonic as opposed to divine. Symbolic of the Order and their practices when it comes to their teachings of their devoted faith that is or never was divine, but in truth, demonic. Furthering this ignorance of the Order's blind faith is the veil that is draped over God by Valtiel. Typically, in Christian, Judaism, or even Islamic cultures, the practice of covering a woman's faith with a veil signifies purity, innocence, and the transition into a new life. However, the veil can also represent the separation between God and humanity, representing spiritual blindness or a lack of understanding, preventing people from fully grasping God's truth. Ironically, this can be applied to the Order as they rely on blind faith when it comes to grasping the concept of God. For the Order, they lack the understanding of the teachings of God creating humanity, as opposed to their doctrine, which is humanity creating God. In this final confrontation of God, Heather sees a monstrosity before her, seeking death as it shrieks in agony and pain. Heather finds Claudia's clothing on the floor, with her missing, assuming she died during the process of birthing God. With the world at stake, Heather engages in the final battle with God. After a long, painful, and emotional battle, Heather finally defeats God, falling to her knees in defeat. Even though Heather won the battle, she doesn't feel relief with a sense of victory. but rather grief, as she sheds tears, lamenting about her father's death. While she defeated God, saving humanity from its inevitable demise, she still couldn't save her dad, and killing God wasn't going to bring him back. After mourning, Heather returns to Douglas, finding him lying on a park bench, fatigued from his wounds. Pleased to see Heather alive and putting an end to Claudia's plans and the Order's reign of terror, Douglas smiles with contentment. After asking Heather if the Order is truly over, suddenly, the mood shifts as Heather approaches him with a knife, telling him it isn't over, as he is still left alive. Moments after, Heather jokingly lunges at Douglas, pretending she's going to stab him as if she were possessed. Douglas, finding Heather's quote-unquote joke distasteful, is about to ask her a question, but is interrupted by her telling him he doesn't have to call her Heather anymore. But instead, she decides to readopt her previous name, Cheryl, learning to accept her past lives as not painful memories, but rather a part of who she was, accepting that this trauma and tragedy may have defined her past, but it doesn't have to define her future. Sometime later, Heather properly holds a burial and buries Harry at a cemetery, kneeling before his gravestone, presumably remembering the happy moments and memories they both shared together. During his time, he was still alive. Holding on to that thought as she cherishes it, she looks into the new life ahead of her, awaiting her next journey.